Imagine a spinning globe in front of you. News headlines flash by like lightning. Russian tanks in Eastern Europe, NATO meetings in Brussels, Turkish drones over conflict zones, energy pipelines cutting through continents. Analysts draw arrows and circles on maps, talking about spheres of influence, new Cold Wars, and the clash of civilizations. Now pause that image and overlay another one. A simple desert in 7th century Arabia. No satellites, no microphones, no nuclear weapons. Just a small group of companions sitting around the messenger of Allah, listening as he describes events that will happen near the end of time. Alliances between Muslims and Al-Rum, a colossal war called Malhama al Kubra, the conquest of Constantinople, the emergence of al-Masih ad-Dajjal, and the descent of Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam. On one side, superpowers, tanks, sanctions, UN speeches. On the other, a few sentences preserved in books of hadith for more than 1,400 years. This contrast is what pulls so many hearts towards the topic of Russia, Turkey, and Ghazwa Rome. People look at the modern world and ask, are we seeing the early sketch of those prophecies? Is Russia part of Al-Rum? What about Europe and America? Where does Turkey fit, standing with one foot in Europe, one foot in Asia, and a history that passes directly through Constantinople? Before we dive into geopolitics, we need a clear foundation. When the prophet used the word Al-Rum, he wasn't talking about today's Russia, NATO, or the EU. For the companions, Al-Rum meant the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Its capital was Constantinople, today's Istanbul. It was a powerful Christian empire, with disciplined armies, fortified cities, and a long intellectual and religious tradition. In the Quran, Surah Ar-Rum mentions them. The Romans have been defeated and they, after their defeat, will be victorious within a few years. For early Muslims, Al-Rum was the superpower of their time. Later, narrations mention that before the Day of Judgment, there will be a huge confrontation between the Muslims and Al-Rum, an alliance, a fallout, and then the great battle of Malhama al Kubra, sometimes compared to an Armageddon-type war. These narrations describe massive casualties, intense fighting, and then, close in time, other major signs of the hour. The appearance of Dajjal, the descent of Isa alayhi salamu, and the final chapters of human history. This is where curiosity, and sometimes wild speculation, begin. Because when people hear Romans, they don't think of emperors in togas anymore. They think of modern Europe, of the Christian West, of America, of Russia, of global alliances. A whole online industry has grown around connecting every new headline to ahadith. This war is Malhama, that coalition is the alliance with Al-Rum, this political leader is Dajjal, that city is the final battlefield. The temptation is strong. It makes the news feel personal, charged, and spiritually significant. It turns every notification into a possible sign of the hour. But there is a danger here. The prophet gave us true information about the future. That information is light. It is guidance. Our interpretations, however, are not revelation. They can be wrong, they can change, and they can mislead if we treat them like absolute facts. Scholars for centuries have warned against taking every conflict and forcing it into a prophetic template, because when predictions fail, people don't just lose trust in the analyst, they start doubting the text themselves. Allah protect us. So how do we talk about Russia, Turkey, and Ghazwa Rome in a way that is responsible, grounded, and still deeply captivating? We start by understanding history properly. We ask, who were the Romans? How did their legacy move from Rome in Italy to Constantinople in Turkey, and then spread into Europe and even Russia? Why do some Russians see Moscow as the third Rome? Why does Turkey stand at the crossing point of all of this, geographically, historically, and politically? And then we ask a more important question. What does all of this mean for the heart of an ordinary Muslim? Because the prophet didn't give us these prophecies so we could spend nights arguing in comment sections. He gave them to prepare our iman, to warn us about the intensity of fitn, the spread of confusion, the power of propaganda and falsehood, and to show that despite all of that, Allah's plan moves steadily towards justice. So in this journey, we will look at three levels at once. On the surface, the maps, the energy routes, the military alliances between Russia, Turkey, and the West. Below that, The long memory of Rome, from the ancient empire to Byzantium to Christian Europe to Russian Orthodox identity. And deeper still, the battlefield inside your own chest, between heedlessness and remembrance, between Dunya and Akira, between the Qur'an app on your phone and the distractions that drag you away from it. If you stay with this until the end, the goal is not that you finish with a neat little chart saying, Russia equals this hadith, Turkey equals that hadith, NATO equals al-Rum. The goal is that you finish with a sharper vision. You see politics more clearly, you see revelation more humbly, and you see your own responsibility more seriously. Because Malhama al Kubra will happen when Allah wills. Ghazwa Rome will unfold exactly as He has written. You and I can't control that timing, but we can control who we are when those waves finally hit. To really understand why Russia, Turkey, and Ghazwa Rome feel so charged, you have to zoom the camera far back and watch history move in slow motion. The first Rome sat in Italy, the heart of the classical Roman Empire. Legions marched out from there, roads and aqueducts spread, emperors claimed to rule the civilized world. But empires do not last forever. The western half of Rome weakened and fell, while the eastern half survived and reshaped itself as the Byzantine Empire. Its capital was no longer Rome, but Constantinople. For centuries, Constantinople was the jewel of the Christian world. Thick walls, golden domes, scholars and bishops, armies and fleets. This was al-Rum, in the eyes of the early Muslims. When companions heard the word Rum, they thought of this Christian empire, not of modern Europe or Moscow or Washington. Then something remarkable happened. In the middle of that long history, the prophet gave a prophecy that sounded almost impossible. Constantinople will certainly be conquered. What a wonderful commander will that commander be, and what a wonderful army will that army be. At that time, Muslims were a small ummah on the edge of the map. Constantinople was huge, fortified, rich. But Revelation does not care about current power balances. Decades turned into centuries. Many Muslim armies tried and failed. Then, in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II Mehmed al-Fatih led the Ottoman forces that finally broke through those legendary walls. The city that had been Rome in the Quranic sense became the capital of a Muslim empire. Hagia Sophia turned from a cathedral into a masjid. The adhan echoed where church bells used to ring. For Muslims, this was not just a military victory. It was a living fulfillment of the Prophet's words. The hadith about the conquest of Constantinople moved from books into reality. Al-Rum had been beaten on its own throne. But the story didn't end there. When Constantinople fell, Christian thinkers across Europe and beyond had to ask, who carries the Roman Christian legacy now? Western Europe, with its popes and kings and later its colonial empires, saw itself as the heir. But in the far northeast, something else was happening. The Russian state, built around the Orthodox Church, began to see itself as the new guardian of that legacy. They developed an idea. The first Rome fell. The second Rome, Constantinople, has fallen to the Muslims. Moscow is now the third Rome, and there will be no fourth. In their imagination, they had inherited the spiritual and historical role of Rome as the fortress of Christianity. Think about this. On one side, Western Europe and later America, mostly Christian, shaped by Roman law, Greek philosophy, biblical stories, leading NATO, the EU, global financial institutions. On another side, Russia, deeply tied to the Orthodox Church, viewing itself as the last line in a long Christian-Roman chain. On the edge of both worlds, Turkey, the land that once housed Constantinople, once capital of the Ottoman Caliphate, now a republic that sits inside NATO but also feels the beating heart of the Muslim Ummah. So when Muslims today read ahadith about alliances with al-Rum, about a great battle with al-Rum before the hour, it's no surprise that minds jump to Europe, America, Russia, NATO, and Turkey. You hear a narration that before the final massive confrontation, Muslims and al-Rum will actually fight side by side against a third enemy. After a victory, an argument will break out. One side will accuse the other of betrayal. An insult will be thrown. A cross will be raised. Tempers will explode. And then the great Malhama will begin, a war so devastating that, as some reports say, from every 100 fighters, only a handful will survive. Is that third enemy some power in the East? Could it be forces in the Middle East? Some Muslims point at Russia as the third enemy when they think of NATO and Turkey. Others see Russia plus Christians together as al-Rum, and maybe secular forces or other nations as the third side. Some imagine Turkey leaving NATO and joining a Muslim bloc to fulfill the role of the believers in those narrations. You can see how flexible and how dangerous this game becomes. Lines on a modern map are not mentioned by name in hadith. The Prophet never said Russia, never said America, never said NATO or UN. He did not give us the names of presidents, nor the dates of elections, nor the exact start of wars. He gave us principles, descriptions, and signposts. Our job is not to force every alliance and every conflict into a hadith and say, this is 100% that prophecy and nothing else. Our job is to look at the world with two eyes. One eye on reality, one eye on revelation. With one eye, we see that Turkey's position is unique. It controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles, the gates between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It is a NATO member, yet often clashes politically with Western partners. It speaks for Palestinian rights louder than many. Its society swings between secular nationalism and Islamic revival. It holds the memory of the Ottoman Caliphate, even if that institution no longer exists. With the same eye, we see that Russia is locked in a long struggle with the West, over influence in Eastern Europe, over pipelines, over ideology. It has a deep Christian identity in many circles, and an old narrative of being the Third Rome. It intervenes in Syria on the side of a brutal regime, while many Western countries claim to fight terrorism, but often fuel chaos and occupation in Muslim lands. Alliances shift, but the suffering of the ordinary believer seems constant. With the other eye, we see that the Prophet warned us. Near the end of time, fitan will be widespread, killing will increase, truth will be mixed with falsehood, and huge battles will erupt. He told us that in those days, holding on to faith will be like holding on to hot coal. He told us about a time when the best place for a Muslim might be away from the centers of corruption and conflict, protecting faith more than chasing power. If you only use the first eye, politics without revelation, you fall into despair, anger, or blind nationalism. If you only use the second eye, quoting narrations without understanding the real world, you fall into fantasy, shallow analysis, and sometimes disaster. The balance is to understand how power works on Earth while never forgetting who truly owns all power. Russia can draw its maps. NATO can sign its treaties. Turkey can swing between East and West. But none of them can escape the decree of Allah. None of them can bring al-Malhama forward by 1 hour, nor delay it by 1 hour, beyond what he has written. They are actors on a stage whose script is already known to the author. And you? You are not in the Kremlin. You are not in the Pentagon. You are not in the presidential palace in Ankara or Brussels. But you are absolutely on the stage of history. Every salah you pray, every sin you leave, every ayah of Quran you recite, is being recorded in the same divine system that controls the destinies of empires. The question is not just, where will Russia and Turkey stand when Malhama breaks? The deeper question is, where will your heart stand when fitna comes close? Maybe right now you're watching this on a phone, half lying on your bed, thumb ready to scroll to the next video as soon as this one ends. Outside, the world is buzzing with headlines about sanctions, drone strikes, coups, elections, protests. Inside your screen, commentators are connecting all of it to prophecies. This is Malhama. That is the alliance with al-Rum. This leader is preparing for Ghazwa-e-Rome. It's exciting. It feels like living in a movie. But there is another battle happening that almost no one discusses in those analyses. It's the battle for your attention span, for your sense of urgency, for your relationship with Allah's words. Because what use is it to know the names of all the generals in the last war, if you die before the first shot is fired? What use is it to map every possible combination of Russia, Turkey, and the West onto hadith, if your own salah is empty, your Quran is closed, your heart is numb? Malhama al Kubra, Ghazwa-e-Rome, these are not stories to entertain us. They are warnings to wake us. They tell us that history is not random, that civilizations are not permanent, that even Rome, in all its forms, rises, falls and shifts hands according to Allah's plan. They tell us that near the end, truth and falsehood will clash openly, and that standing on the right side will cost blood, comfort, and maybe life itself. And then they quietly ask, if you and I cannot win the small wars against laziness, against addiction, against arrogance, against cruelty to our own families, how will we ever dream of standing firm in the Great War? It is easy to imagine ourselves in a glorious future, marching under a pure banner, reciting takbir as we face the Romans. It is harder to turn off a sinning app tonight. It is harder to apologize to someone we wronged. It is harder to wake up for far when no one is watching. Yet, those small choices are exactly what form the spiritual backbone of the kind of believers who, if Allah wills, might be chosen for those mighty times. Russia will continue to calculate its interests. Turkey will continue to balance East and West. The so-called heirs of Rome will continue to write their strategies. Maybe you and I will live to see some of the bigger signs unfold. Maybe our lives will end long before that. But our Qiyamah begins the day our soul is taken, not the day the first missiles fly in Malhama. So when you hear the words Ghazwa Rome, don't only picture distant armies. Picture the Rome inside you. The arrogance, the love of status, the worship of human beings, celebrities, ideologies. Every time you choose to obey those instead of Allah, a little Ghazwa has been lost. Every time you choose Allah's command over them, a little victory has been won. When you hear Malhama al Kubra, don't only imagine nuclear fire and ruined cities. Remember the quieter Malhama of ideas and desires, the constant pressure to dilute your deen, to erase your identity, to soften your tawheed until it offends no one and changes nothing. In that war, your shield is knowledge, your sword is sincere. Dua, your supply line is the Quran you recite and live by. The companions did not become who they were because they knew every future battle by name. They became who they were because when revelation came, they said, "We hear and we obey." They prepared for the unseen by obeying in the seen. They trusted that whatever shape Rome and Persia and all future empires would take, Allah's promise would never fail. You and I are not asked to draw the final map of Malhama. We are asked to be believers when it comes. So here is the real geopolitical tasvir that matters most tonight. A single heart, your heart, somewhere between East and West, between Dunya and Akira. Strategy meetings are happening over it as well, not in fancy conference rooms, but in whispers of shaitan, in promises of desire, in reminders of angels, in ayat that reach your ears. Whose alliance will you sign? When the video ends, when the sound fades and the screen goes dark, Russia and Turkey will still be where they are on the map. The prophecies will still be true. The Malhama will still be ahead, at a time only Allah knows. But your next move right now is under your control. You could scroll on, hunting for a more sensational theory. Or you could take this as your personal briefing and make a quieter, braver decision. To return to your salah with more presence, to open the Quran with more hunger, to seek knowledge instead of rumors, to clean your heart of hidden idols before talking about the idols of nations. In the end, Ghazwa Rome will be written in the blood of armies. Your story will be written in the ink of your daily choices. Make them worthy of a Lord who controls all empires, who foretold all Malhama, and who still waits for your sincere labbaik in the small, secret moments of your life.